Welcome to the PlantFit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Dr. Colin Campbell. Due to popular demand on the topic of food, gene expression, and cancer, we have decided to replay this session with Dr. Campbell that was aired on the 2017 PlantFit Summit. It's jam-packed with information and research that Dr. Campbell has conducted over the past few decades as the founding father of plant-based nutrition as we know it today. Dr. Campbell has been dedicated to the science of human health for more than 60 years. We start the conversation with Dr. Campbell sharing about his early days as a researcher on nutrition. Enjoy the presentation.
It was all about the evidence. We were actually doing experimental research. We're working in the laboratory and that kind of research, not research just going to the library, but actually doing the research. And so we just would ask questions as we do in science. We make a hypothesis. We test the hypothesis and see what we get. It either agrees or it doesn't agree. And so I really liked science. It was a lot of fun. And I just went where the research took us. Now, having said that, I should tell you that this started really in the Philippines. When I was there working with my senior colleague to set up a nationwide program for feeding malnourished children and making sure they got enough protein. That was it. That was consistent with my personal and professional background, to believe that the more protein we get, the better. And that meant basically protein from animal-based foods. So in any case, while there, I happened to notice, that I thought at least, that the families who were consuming the most protein, a fairly small fraction, at least like the West, they were the ones likely to have children more likely to get liver cancer, which is strange. And I didn't take it too seriously until I saw a report from India, an experimental animal report that coincided with that. What they found was that experimental animals exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer, if they fed them higher levels of protein, the normal levels actually, they all got cancer. If they fed them lower levels of protein, they did not. So two observations, first in the children, secondly in experimental animal setting. So I said it was time to do some research. So I got some funding from the National Institutes of Health here in the United States and set up a program that lasted for the next 27 years. And so we just did an enormous amount of research, published a lot of it, of course, all of it really, in really good journals. So we had a chance to get feedback, from my colleagues. So it was done as professionally as we knew how. And what I really learned was that it was the opposite, what I thought. In the Indian work, by the way, what they found that the animals, got more protein, got more cancer, and they said it was exactly the opposite of what I thought we were seeing, and they thought too. So when we got involved in research, I wanted to find out first, could we repeat what the study they did? And we did. And secondly, maybe more significantly, I was interested in understanding the mechanism by which this occurs. When we see something like this, so unexpected and so different, so provocative, then at that point in time, we turn our attention to understanding, well, how does that work? If we can understand how it works, then it's much more believable, obviously. We spent many years then just understanding how it worked. And in all of that research over the years, I ended up turning on its head our understanding of nutrition. There were so many things that we noticed at the time that we didn't expect it. And so ever since then, not only did we sort of learn early on that high protein relates to more cancer experimentally, but also there was a whole lot of other features about that research which was very provocative. And there you have it. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned you try to understand the mechanism. So I guess before we jump into, all the other things that you found out on nutrition, maybe can you walk us through what mechanism actually is in place or what happens in the body for animal proteins to trigger cancer?
well, the mechanism that I'm talking about are biochemical in nature. They're intracellular. And so we learned, for example, that the high protein diet increased the rate at which the carcinogen got inside of the cell. That was one thing. It's a very complicated process, but that's what turned out to be the case. And I thought, well, there's the answer. That's why it occurs. But then when the carcinogen comes into the cell, then it gets metabolized to a product that's very reactive, that in turn binds to DNA, which is part of the gene, and causes a mutation. The whole process. So what we found was that the high protein diet increased the amount of the enzyme that activates the carcinogen. That's two mechanisms. And then thirdly, and this enzyme is a very complex system, we found that the high protein diet rearranged the complexity of that enzyme in such a way that it was more active. So there's three mechanisms. Which one counts? And so then finally, in that next one, we also learned that the high protein diet increased the amount of the carcinogen that actually binds to the DNA to initiate the mutation. And that's how all cancer starts, by the way. Cancer starts with mutations. So here's four possible mechanisms. And in every case, every time we looked, we saw something like that. Now, our bodies have an ability to correct these problems when they occur, and they do occur throughout our lives. There's always potential mutations likely to happen and will happen. But our body has this amazing capacity to repair that damage. And what did the protein do to that repair mechanism? It compromised it. It ruined it. So, in other words, the protein is pushing the cancer to form, and then it's compromising the ability of the body to correct it. That was pretty fascinating. And then we went to the second phase of cancer, when the cancer grows, and we learned again, I won't go through all the details, but we learned we looked for what turned out to be about 10 mechanisms. And every time, 100% of the time, the high protein diet turned on the cancer process. That is pretty convincing. I mean, there's no way that you can get away from that. Yes, it was in experimental animals, but mammals all have essentially the same biochemistry, including us humans. So when you see something like that, that is very provocative and very convincing. And during the course of those experiments, we learned a lot of things. Like for example, we could turn on cancer growth and turn it off just by changing the level of protein in the diet. And that was the first time, and still today is almost the only time that's ever been shown in cancer research. We usually think of cancer being caused by carcinogens. That's foreign chemicals in our food. They're involved a little bit, or we think that genes are responsible for cancer. And what we were demonstrating is that neither is the answer. That is to say, just nutrition, when consumed at, let's say, inappropriate levels of consumption, just changing our nutrient intake has this dramatic effect. And so that was obviously very striking. We also learned, just by way of some other ideas, we learned that nutrition controls genes. So in other words, we can have the genes to lead to disease, and we all do. We all have some genes we would rather not have, because diseases start with genes. And, there's a very complex system. There's at least 22 or 23,000 genes. And then the combination of those genes, it's unimaginable, the complexity. And so what we learned was that nutrition, one of the main roles of nutrition is to control our genes. So let's say if we have some genes we'd rather not have, the eating the right kind of food will keep those genes under control. They don't get expressed. And that's a very exciting idea, because Nutrition turns on the good genes, let's say, and turns off the bad genes. Uh, these ideas and that the fact that nutrition is a multi-mechanistic kind of phenomenon, the fact that it could control genes, for example, those are two very big ideas. And so then we learned too that for other nutrients, just beside protein, we saw something similar. And then you finally get to it. Finally got to a stage after many, many years, from my point of view, is asking the question: well, what kind of diet what kind of food should we be consuming? To take this all into consideration. And it turns out, as you know, it's a plant-based diet, number one, and number two, it should be whole food. That's critical. And more or less the intact vegetables and fruits and grains. You eat them that way, because nature has created, in my view, if I can think this way, nature has created these plants with an infinite number of chemicals in the plants, many of which we call nutrients. And they all work in symphony. That's another fascinating idea, or synchrony, maybe I should say. And so by the time, after so many years, I had proof enough. It was very convincing. I had to change. My wife and I began to change our own diet, and we started seeing benefits. And then after that, we had the opportunity to go to China and to look at a human population there to see if we saw amongst the Chinese population, did we have any supporting evidence, we might say. And the reason that we did it in China was because there, the Chinese government during the 1970s had established how much cancer existed in a total of about 2,500 counties. And what they found was that cancer was very different in different counties, hugely. So what that says is maybe it's something in the environment, that maybe it's dietary. So we organized the study and we measured very carefully a large number of different variables in the diet. We measured things in the blood. We measured things in the urine. We had access to, a wide variety of disease mortality rates from China. And that combination, having all that information together, I simply wanted to know, what evidence is there in a human population that maybe would disagree with what we had done in the laboratory? But by that time, it turned out, again, very complex data set, but the evidence clearly supported the idea the closer we get to a whole food, plant-based diet, the healthier we're going to be on all kinds of fronts. In other words, it's a lower cancer, it's lower heart disease, it's lower diabetes, it's lower autoimmune diseases. And at the same time, it tends to encourage better health, maybe more energy, maybe, more fitness, maybe more mental, feeling better about it. So I think what we have, if I can use that word discovered, I mean, we're not really discovering something, but it's equivalent, for me at least, it was a discovery of what nature is. And I like to call it a fact of nature. That's a term that I borrowed from my son, Nelson, who just directed that film, Plant Pure Nature. In any case, it's a nice term because I think we're looking right smack dab in the middle of the whole concept of what is nature. Nature from a biochemical or scientific point of view is almost infinitely complex. We can't even imagine the number of mechanisms that operate together. We can't even imagine the number of chemicals in food that work together. We really can't even imagine all of the various diseases we might get, the various combinations of diseases. Put that whole thing together, and the way I look at it is that once you realize that the food is so powerful, the right kind of food, in keeping control of our health, then all gist of it that I was just describing, what the mechanism is, what this, what that, or which nutrient it is. It's almost, to some extent, it's secondary for sure. The main point is that when we take people, feed them this kind of food, it turns out in a matter of 10 days to 2 weeks, we can see substantial changes. Blood cholesterol drops and people will start feeling better. And if they've got chronic pain, maybe that goes away and so forth. And blood sugar comes down. So it's, for me, it's beyond the stage of doubting it. It's just simply, it's so convincing that now instead of looking for more mechanisms to see, to convince ourselves, rather now when I see something new, I ask myself, does that fit within the framework of a whole food? If it doesn't, then I'm inclined to ask, well, why not? Maybe I did something wrong. So it changes the whole discussion. It changes the approach to things. So that was my game. And by the time I started the research in graduate school in 1956, not exactly on this, but it was on diet and health. And then I had a formal research program starting in 1965. At my university, was there for 10 years, then came to Cornell in 1975. Finally, when 1975, maybe in the middle 70s, early 80s, I started to realize this is real. And so we started changing our own diet. And we gradually changed from I always ate meat, had lots of dairy, eggs, and so forth. And it took us about 10 years, from about 1980 maybe, or until about 1990. By that time, we're 100%. So it's been a very exciting journey.
And I mean, fast forward to where you are right now. I mean, you've, like I shared earlier, you created a movement, and the whole course just to educate the people on your findings, I think is fantastic. I mean, you mentioned earlier about turning on and turning off cancer, because I'm familiar with your work and your research as well. Because I understand by using plant proteins, you don't actually promote cancer. So plant protein actually negates the effect. So I'm just wondering, because since we're on the Plant Fit Summit, I know of a lot of athletes who consume a high amount of plant-based proteins. Does a high amount of plant-based proteins have the same effect as animal-based proteins at all?
No, for two reasons. Number one, the plant-based proteins alone, in isolation, so to speak, they have a different profile of amino acids. And when we start examining those different amino acids and how they combine, they just inherently, have a different property. That's point number one. So in other words, the plant protein doesn't do it. But secondly, when we consume it as whole food, by the way, well, let me add this here. You know, of course, Luke, I think, that when we fed plant-based protein to our animal studies up to the high level, it had no effect. And so that, as I say, that was impressive. But then when you get to the real life situation, the question then becomes what you're just referring to, I think. What if you chose a diet that had a lot of plant protein in it, in the form of whole food, let's say? It doesn't cause any problems. Because now when you're consuming a whole food, in theory, if we assume, for example, for the moment, that the protein in the plant has some activity to do the wrong thing, we don't need to worry about it because all the other things being consumed with the plant protein, the antioxidants, the dietary fiber, so forth and so on, it keeps it under control. So we can consume plant protein. We can have diets and with plant protein really quite high. It's not going to do us any harm.
Amazing. And let's say an athlete, they measure their macros and they want to shoot for a certain percentage in terms of protein and carbs and fats in the diet. So in terms of protein, what percentage can the body actually process at any given time? What should we shoot for?
Well, in experimental studies, we had that question, of course. And what we found was that when we feed protein up to a level of about 10% of total calories, even though it may be animal protein, when it's consumed up to that level of about 10%, in animals that are exposed to a carcinogen, for example, they don't form cancer. And so cancer only begins to form when we're running in excess of 10%. Okay? And as I say, and the reason that you see that effect is because protein is an essential nutrient. We absolutely need protein. And so we need protein up to a level of the minimum we need is about 5 or 6% maybe. But to be on the safe side, we generally in nutrition have recommended 8 to 9, maybe 10%, which is the ideal level. The point is about this is that what that says is that we can get all the protein we need from plant-based foods. Because even the plants, like potatoes or rice, for example, white rice, which are very low in protein, maybe low in protein, they still have about 8 or 9% protein. So we don't eat diets just only with that kind of food. So the fact of the matter is, it sort of gave us an indication of what kind of diet we're talking about. So 10% is all we need. Plants can do that very nicely. We don't need extra protein. One of the things that has confused our human race for a long time is that when protein was discovered in 1839, at that time it was found to be a component of meat. So as a result, these were dog experiments, I should point out. At that time, they discovered this compound called protein. They gave it a name from an ancient Greek word, at least for the English language. They gave it a name. And then at that point, for whatever reason, people were assuming for many years thereafter that protein was only found in animal foods. So even in the modern day, you find a lot of people thinking that protein is synonymous with meat. It's one or the other. And so if for people who decide to eat this way, plant-based, one of the questions they get, and I'm sure you're familiar with that probably, one of the questions they get most often, where do I get my protein? You've probably heard that.
Many times.
Yeah, the answer is just, well, you get all the protein you need in plants. And besides, it's the right kind of protein. That's the most to the point answer.
Sure. So playing devil's advocate here, for example, if someone is wanting to go 80 to 90% plant-based and they still want to have 10% of the calories or 10% protein from meat, firstly, is that possible? And secondly, would that be okay or healthy in your opinion?
That's really an excellent question. Actually, that question really it's a very good question because it gives some nuance, some sort of suggestions as to how we look at nutrition, and how we look at science. I say that I do not say that everyone needs to be a whole food, plant-based diet person 100% of the time for 100% of the conditions. I don't say that because I cannot get scientific research is absolutely convincing on that point, because we really haven't tried it exactly that way. However, what we do know is that the closer we get to a whole food plant-based diet, our health continually from various points of view, our health continually improves. So what I like to say is it's an important sort of nuance. I like to say that the goal is 100% plant-based diet, because I know under those circumstances, no one is really going to suffer any downside. And even though I don't have to defend it on the basis of absolute science, I just know it's always better. So then the question is, I think what you're referring to, well, some people might like to do 80% or 90%. That's good enough for me. The problem with that is that if we only we let's say used about 10% or 20% of the food, the wrong kind of food. What happens in that case? It's always this. This is the way the human brain works. A little bit always becomes more over time. And the best example of that is cigarette smoking. If somebody's smoking cigarettes and you tell them they can have 1 or 2 cigarettes a day, they rebound. They go back to their old habit. And what happens with a whole food plant-based diet, if you get there, this gives your body a chance to adapt to a whole new sort of taste preference idea. So food starts to taste rather differently than what we may have been accustomed to. And when we get there at 100%, it's just easy. Then you don't even think about it. You say, well, okay, I don't want that other stuff. And just eat that way, because then you're really going to optimize your chances. But by the same token, as I said before, some people can eat the wrong food, more or less, for many, many years and not suffer any consequences. That all depends on what kind of susceptibility we may have from our past. But everyone gains. For many people, it's life-saving. For some people, it's certainly improvement in the way one feels. So, I mean, to me, it's fair enough just to say the goal is 100%. And what I do, I say, okay, the goal is 100%. And for any of you who take a step in that direction, I honor the step you take. But they're always being aware. Maybe they're 80%. Well, then they begin to know, I could do a little better. And their taste preferences begin to change. The first thing you know, they're at 100%. I think it's a more reasonable way to consider this evidence rather than being, black and white answers. Don't do this, do that kind of thing. I don't think that's a very, very effective way to tell the story.
And obviously we've talked about cancer, right? But you mentioned already that we have the disease, all kinds of diseases in the genes already, right? So what other diseases would nutrition affect besides cancer?
That's a really good question, too, because it turns out the whole food plant-based diet actually prevents and in many cases reverses a wide variety of diseases. That's another concept, incidentally, exactly the opposite what we tend to assume with drugs. If you stop to think about it, drugs are made specifically for a specific purpose. And doctors don't like to talk about the idea that a single drug can do a whole lot of things at the same time, because it's usually true. They can't. But in the case of the diet, the whole food plant-based diet, it has what we call a broad array of disease effects. Heart disease of various kinds, stroke, coronary heart disease, atrial fibrillation, for example, cancers of various and sundry different kinds of cancers, autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, Sugar's disease, and many other. There's a lot of different kinds of autoimmune diseases. Those are the kind of diseases, as you may know, where our own antibodies are attacking some of our own tissue. And so through some prior experience for that happening. So, and then also at the same time, this diet, if it's done regularly and we stay with it the right way, we end up consuming more or less the right number of calories almost automatically. And so we keep the weight off, the body weight off. And of course, we have also evidence that even eye diseases, bone diseases, whatever. I mean, these diseases all improve. That's another reason I call it the fact of nature, because, it's doing all this stuff. And it really truly is amazing.
It's sure. I mean, it seems like it's really the answer for everything. I just want to go back a little bit to what you said earlier about 100% whole food plant-based diet, because right now there is the 100% whole food plant-based diet, there's the vegan, and there's the vegetarian diet as well. And I know many individuals who become vegan, for example, for moral and ethical reasons. How important do you think is important for people to follow a healthy whole food plant-based diet versus a vegan or vegetarian diet?
It's really important. And by the way, I've written on a couple of occasions in recent years the fact that I don't really like the words vegan and vegetarian because I honor the rationale for making that choice. That's not the issue. I mean, the rationale for most vegans and certainly in a lot of vegetarians, the rationale for their choosing that lifestyle is for ethical and moral reasons. That's fair enough. I support that. That's not the issue. But we can't. I don't like to use those words because the general practice of vegans and vegetarians is not very good. There was a study done, for example, just last year. I think is the best evidence on this point. It's a big study in Europe called the EPIC study, EPIC. In any case, that study is 500,000 people, and they have in that study about 20,000 vegans, if you will, and they have followed them. And they published some data here about a year ago showing that the nutrient composition of the vegan and vegetarian diets, in terms of the amount of protein, not protein, in terms of the amount of fat, and in terms of the amount of refined carbohydrate like sugar, they're the same as meat eaters. So, you look at how much fat in terms of percent of calories, all three diets, vegetarian, vegan, and meat eating, in that big cohort, they're all consuming about 30% of total calories as fat. The same is true with sugar. They're using, to be exact, they're using about 22% sugar. So with those circumstances, although it's good that the vegans are not using animals, they got one issue corrected. But then they turn around and add a lot of sugar and fatty foods. And so what they may have gained, they lose to some extent. And so vegans will still get heart disease. They'll still get some cancer because they're really not doing it the right way. That's the reason I'm the one that was the first one to suggest the term whole food plant-based. That was about 35 years ago. Because the vegan vegetarian communities, quite frankly, they don't take very kindly to my story because they say it came from the use of experimental animals. I understand that. But, we can't throw that out either, that kind of information. That's ridiculous. And so I like to emphasize the word whole food, plant-based. It's a little bit awkward, admittedly, but it sort of sends a signal that this is based on science. It's not based on ideology.
Yeah, and I like the distinction, and I think it's important because oftentimes studies are quoted saying, vegan still have this disease and vegans are also exposed to cancer and whatnot as a way to prove that a whole plant-based diet doesn't work. But as you just mentioned, those are two completely different setups. And if any study were to say anything about a whole food plant-based diet, they should look at vegans, but they should look at what you're suggesting. And given that we're on the Plant Fit Summit, right, I would love to find out also from an athlete's point of view how a plant-based diet might help, performance, be it physically or mentally, and also longevity, because obviously as athletes, being exposed to hard training sessions and injuries and that sort of thing.
Yeah, on the physical front, I have come and gotten to know personally, in many cases, a number of world-class athletes. I mean, the best of the best. And they have, in fact, although they may have for some of their career, consumed protein supplements and, all that sort of stuff and a lot of animal food, when they switch, oftentimes their athletic performance actually improves. It's really quite remarkable. And so now I have friends who are a world-class golfer, Gary Player, for example, from South Africa, or we call him Hall of Fame football player, in baseball or basketball or running or weightlifting, even weightlifting, wrestling, boxing, all of that. I know somebody from all those communities who have tried this. And what they find is they get improvement. They may lose some weight, which is good. That's a good thing. But their muscles become better toned, we like to say. Just better shape. And that's one of the things that they say in common. So physically, and incidentally, this kind of research was first done, to my knowledge, at least in the modern day. It was done in 1905, 112 years ago. And it was published in 2 books. But the people in those days, the other scientists, ignored that. But a very nicely done research. There were 2 books published by a professor at Yale University in Connecticut. And so he established very clearly that athletes who switch over to a plant-based, low-protein diet, their performance actually increased, which is quite remarkable. On the mental sort of front, if you will, there's less evidence, and it's hard to sometimes measure that kind of thing. And so what I'm really relying on in that case is just anecdotal reports from a lot of people. I feel better. I can think more clearly. I can do this. I can do. And and also the biochemistry supports the idea that as far as brain chemistry is concerned, we do in fact behave a little better. And to say nothing of the fact that our behavior, I should say, tends to change. I've got a former student of mine. Just what I'm referring to, I had a former student of mine who, she came back to school, in graduate school, when she was about 45 years of age. And she had been doing some of this in the school with little children. And so she started doing this for schools for part of her doctorate research, her doctorate dissertation, and seeing these remarkable changes in these little children. And then she had an opportunity to do it with some young teenage delinquents in prison in Miami, Florida. And she went there and she got them, I think they were 19 or something like that. She went into the prison, showed them how to make this food. They all got excited about it, quite frankly. And their attitude really changed substantially. They kept diaries. They couldn't believe what was happening to them. And so, whereas many of them had a tendency to be violent, that dissipated. And I actually think that's a story, by the way, and she did it elsewhere too. I think that story is one story that has not been told enough, because I maintain that if we were to go to the prisons, where we have a lot of prisons in this country, we have more than any other country, but unfortunately, but if we were to go to the prisons and feed those prisoners the right food, we would see remarkable changes. It's just it's kind of staggering to realize what you can do with this. So I find that is a very exciting sort of aspect of this question.
It's very, very interesting because I myself, I compete and I find that my performance has increased significantly because of a plant-based diet. Managed to drop a lot of body fat, I recover a lot faster. And for me personally, I subscribe to a whole food plant-based perspective, probably about 10 to 15% fat, 10 to 15% protein. I want to zero in on fat right now because right now we're looking, of course, whole food plant-based, there's 10% fat, that's what you're advocating. Then right now there's the high fat proponents that say, well, in 1970s, the low fat kind of guidelines were implemented, and as a result, there's now a war on sugar because sugar is really the bad guy and fat really is healthy. What's your take on that?
That's a very, unfortunately, a very unfortunate and very distorted conversation that we've had with ourselves for the last 30 or 40 years. There's no question about that. In the early days on heart and then on cancer, and I was one of the authors of one of these reports on cancer. In those days, one of the things we did choose to do was to recommend lower total fat intake. And we did not, we only recommended decreasing from an average around 38 to 40% down to 30%. And the only reason we did that, it was not that we thought that was the answer to everything. That was only a mechanism to suggest to the public that that's one place to start, because a lot of the fat came from animal-based foods. Otherwise, it would have been a very sensitive matter. So we said, okay, come down to 30%. And quite frankly, some of our critics of the modern day say that we did the low-fat diet and it didn't work. That's a lie. That's a flat-out lie, because we did not get down. As a population, we didn't even get down to 30%. And it does nothing, because for those who, there's been some studies on this, those who did get down, let's say, to 30 or 25 experimentally, for example, and then let's say they did it for a year or two, what they were doing while they're decreasing fat, they're increasing the concentration of protein, animal protein at that. So they're not gaining anything because it turns out that animal protein is more important in this whole equation than is fat. Now, having come back to, there's another point I want to make, and this is may sound a little bit complicated, but not really. When I think of fat, and the way we should think of fat, is to divide it in two parts. Well, let's talk about added fat as one category. And then the other category is the fat in food, naturally present in food. So then the question becomes, are they equally bad? I think that's the question. And a lot of my colleagues get quite confused about this. The added fat, especially as added oil, not good. It's not good because here in the United States and elsewhere, I think to a great extent, the added oil coming from corn and stuff like that, it's what we call the omega-6 variety of oils, omega-6 fats. Omega-6 fats are pro-inflammatory, not good. And so they tend to distort the balance of the omega-6 fats with the omega-3 fats. Omega-3 fats are anti-inflammatory. Omega-6 is pro-inflammatory. And so in a society in the United States and to a great extent elsewhere, when people start dumping a lot of oil in their food, maybe on salads, maybe in frying foods and so forth, what we're doing, we now have a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, something like 15 to 20 to 1, when it should be about 1 to 1, 2 to 1. So the added oil is not a good idea. We should not be adding oil to our diet because pro-inflammatory effects increase the risk of cancer, increase the risk of heart disease, and all sorts of other issues. So added oil is, in my mind, there's no point. It should be zero. Now, that's one thing. The other kind of fat, of course, is the kind that you find in food. And the kind you find in food may be saturated, it may be unsaturated, it may be monounsaturated, as with olive oil, for example. You got those different kinds of fats and oils. Saturated fat is solid at room temperature. Unsaturated is liquid at room temperature. The unsaturated you tend to find in plants. The saturated you tend to find in animals. Well, it turns out the kind of fat that's the worst is the polyunsaturated fats in plants, not animals. But you see that distinction only when the total fat intake is high in the diet. So it's another reason to keep the total fat down, especially with added oils. But if we're talking about plants that are high in fat or oil, like peanuts, legumes, a coconut in your part of the world is also a significant issue, or maybe olives in the Mediterranean area. Those kind of oils are somewhat different. The coconut oil is more saturated. And so there's been an argument against coconut use because it's saturated. That's nonsense. That is nonsense. Because just if it's in the form of the whole food, we don't see these really bad effects that way. And so, and that's the key, whole food. I don't mean to say that we can make a whole meal on just coconut or legumes or something like that. I'm simply saying that if you just make it part in general of the diet, like nuts and seeds, for example, I don't see any problem. I don't see any problem. And as a matter of fact, if you're using the peanuts or certain other kinds of legumes and so forth, if you're using quite a lot of those kind of food in our diet, and let's say the fat goes up to 15%, 20%, even 25%, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of difference. Because what we're doing, we're consuming the whole food. And whatever theoretical damage may occur because of the oil there, if we're keeping the total fat intake down, it makes no difference. That's the catch. And so this whole subject is at the moment too confusing for my taste.
While we're still on the topic of fat, the individuals that promote like a high-fat diet, they talk about things like indigenous populations like the Maasai, like the Eskimos, And also there's this thing called the French paradox, where a high amount of saturated fat in these populations and in these cultures, there isn't any case of heart disease. What's your take on that?
Well, on the Maasai in Africa, for example, that's the one group that's been talked about quite a lot. It turns out that, okay, I just got a notice here from my wife. If you're talking about the diet of the Maasai in Africa, they do a lot of walking, they're nomadic, and so forth. They're very quite healthy, really. Well, there were studies done on them back in the 1950s and 60s when they found that their cholesterol level was lower than expected because they mostly consumed meat, milk, and eggs, meat, milk, and blood, for example. And so they had less heart disease than what you otherwise would expect. That was in the early 50s. So everybody made that story, enlarged on that story. And then it turned out later that the same gentleman who was doing that first research went back to the Maasai, and he had an opportunity to examine 50 people who had died, examine their bodies for heart disease. And it turned out their level of heart disease was as high as it is in the old American man. So they still have heart disease. The only thing that they had in their advantage to keep from getting it as early as what we do in the West is because there's so much exercise. And there's, so that tends to help to attenuate it. The other thing about that particular group of people is they didn't live hardly long enough to get the heart disease. They died of other reasons. The same is true of the Eskimos. If you go back and look, and now we know from modern data, the Eskimos, one of the chief problems they have is broken bones because of all that calcium and not too much protein. We now are beginning to know there's those early reports on Eskimos and indigenous peoples and stuff like that weren't exactly accurate. Now, they were accurate in the sense that if you went to those indigenous populations and they were mostly consuming local food, usually meaning mostly plant food, they're also exercising a lot. They're in pretty good shape. They're getting the benefit of a lot of plant food. They're not consuming very much extra oil or fat. And so they're in pretty good shape. But unfortunately, some of the scientists of the modern day or during the last 3 or 4 decades have really distorted those results and talked about them as, for some reason, there are exceptions to the rule. Not true.
I think it's just more of an inspiration for everyone watching out there. What keeps you motivated to keep sharing the message that you do, and despite lots of resistance in your early days?
I get faced with that a lot, even in the modern day. What keeps me going is because I'm really confident that this is the healthiest way we can live, number one. Number two, now we have really good evidence. This is very important for the environment. The environmental issue is really important, and much of the global warming and climate change has been attributed to livestock. I've spoken to the United Nations headquarters in Rome, who are actually promoting this, and so I showed them the film, I gave a talk, and so forth. And that's a really important point, is the environment. We've got to change because the environment is, quite frankly, is going downhill, number one. Number two, the cost of health care, at least in a country like the United States, the costs are escalating at a very rapid rate. It's going to actually crush our economy. It's already causing serious problems. And the third reason is the old reason, animal welfare, peace, and that sort of thing. So you put all this together, personal health, cost of health care, climate, it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. We need to do it for our own sake as well as for the sake of our families and the sake of the planet. Just period. And there's no alternative way of approaching this problem. So I will continue talking about this until my last days, because I just think it's that important. I hate to see people dying early who didn't know this information. And one of the things that really gets me going is when our government gets involved in trying to stop this information, which they do, and a lot of governments do, then I say enough is enough. I'm going to be challenging them.
Yeah, and we thank you for challenging them, and we know you've been involved in in the whole policy making process in the past. And we wish you all the best and strength to keep doing, and hope to do our part as well.
Indeed.
Thank you. I'd be happy to come back again and talk. That's another whole subject, the government.
Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, for your time.
Okay.
Great chatting.
Thank you for having me, and I do hope we can meet sometime. And
I'm sure we will. I look forward to that day. Thank you. Have a good day. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good
See
night.
you. Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.